The Mind Gym Academy presents The Power of I Feel, Expressing Emotions and Self-Awareness. Chapter 1. Bottled Up. Ben had learned early on to keep things to himself. It wasn't that he didn't feel emotions. He felt them a lot. But somewhere along the way, he started believing that talking about them wouldn't help. When he was a kid, he had tried. He had told his dad once that he felt nervous before a school presentation. His dad had shrugged and said, "Everyone gets nervous. Just do it." He had told a coach that he was frustrated about not getting enough playing time. The coach had replied, "Complaining won't help. Work harder." He had told a friend that he felt left out when they made plans without him. The friend had laughed and said, "You're being too sensitive." So eventually, Ben learned that keeping quiet was easier. Because what was the point of talking about things if no one really listened? The mask he wore. By the time he was in high school, bottling things up had become second nature. He played the part of someone who was fine, always fine. At school, he went through the motions. At home, he kept to himself. With friends, he laughed at their jokes, even when he didn't feel like it. Because if he just pretended long enough, maybe his feelings would go away. They never did. The signs of cracks. Ben wasn't sure when it started, but lately things had been harder to ignore. His grades were slipping, his motivation was disappearing, his patience was running out. But still, he said nothing. Until one day, everything cracked. The breaking point. It started in third period. Ben stared at the history quiz in front of him, his mind blank. He had studied, at least he had tried. But the words on the page blurred together. His pencil hovered over the first question. Nothing. His stomach tightened. I can't fail this. I already failed the last one. His grip on the pencil tightened. Tick, tick, tick. The clock taunted him with every second that passed. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. And then... Time's up! Ben's chest caved in. He barely managed to write anything. As the teacher walked around to collect the quizzes, Ben stared down at his paper. It looked empty, just like his brain had felt, just like he had been feeling for weeks. Something inside him snapped. The explosion. At lunch, Ben sat at the usual table, barely touching his food. His best friend Jason nudged him. "Dude, you good?" Ben wasn't good, but that wasn't something he said out loud. "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered. Jason frowned. "Are you sure? You've been acting." "I said I'm fine." The words came out sharper than he meant. Jason blinked. "All right, chill." Ben felt the guilt immediately, but instead of apologizing, he just looked away. Because if he apologized, that meant talking about it. And if he talked about it, that meant admitting he wasn't fine. And he couldn't do that. Not yet. The moment that changed everything. By the end of the day, Ben felt exhausted. Not physically, mentally, emotionally. Carrying so much inside him, never letting anything out, was getting harder. He was drained. He just wanted to go home. But then, as he was stuffing his books into his backpack, he heard someone say his name. "Ben, can you come by my office for a second?" He turned. Mr. Ray, the school counselor. Ben froze. The counselor. That meant feelings. That meant talking. He didn't need that. Did he? I'm kind of busy," Ben said quickly. "I've got homework." Mr. Ray didn't look convinced. "It won't take long." Ben hesitated. For some reason, he didn't say no. And that one decision, it changed everything. Chapter 2. The Breaking Point. Ben followed Mr. Ray down the hallway, his steps slow, dragging. He didn't want to go. He didn't need to go. But somehow he wasn't saying no either. As they entered the counselor's office, Ben took everything in. The bookshelves lined with self-help books, the posters about growth mindset and positive thinking, the couch that looked way too comfortable for his liking. He didn't sit. Instead, he hovered by the door. "So, what's this about?" Mr. Ray sat at his desk, completely unfazed. "I just noticed you've been a little off lately." Ben scoffed. "I'm fine. Mr. Ray nodded, like he expected that answer. All right, but just in case, you want to sit down? Ben hesitated. Then with a sigh, he dropped onto the couch, arms crossed. He just had to get through this. Then he could go back to pretending everything was fine. The silence game. Mr. Ray didn't start with a lecture, didn't press him with a bunch of touchy-feely questions. Instead, he sat back and let the silence stretch. Ben hated silence. It made him feel exposed, like his thoughts were too loud. After a long pause, Mr. Ray finally spoke. You know, most people think keeping emotions inside makes them stronger. Ben shifted in his seat but said nothing. Mr. Ray continued. But what happens when you shake a soda can? Ben frowned. What? If you shake a soda can, all the pressure builds up inside, right? Ben gave a half-hearted shrug. I guess. Mr. Ray tilted his head. And what happens when you open it? Ben exhaled sharply. It explodes. Exactly. Ben stared at the floor. He knew where this was going, but he wasn't a soda can. He could handle it. He had always handled it, hadn't he? The first crack. Mr. Ray leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. Tell me something, Ben. When was the last time you told someone how you were actually feeling? Ben didn't answer, because the real answer, he couldn't remember. Mr. Ray let the silence sit for a moment, then stood up and grabbed a whiteboard marker. He walked to the board and wrote, I feel blank because blank. Ben read it but didn't say anything. Mr. Ray turned back to him. Go ahead, fill in the blanks. Ben's jaw tensed. I don't know. Mr. Ray smiled a little. That's okay. Start simple. What's one emotion you felt today? Ben exhaled. I don't know. Annoyed? Okay, why? Ben hesitated. Then before he could stop himself, he muttered, I feel annoyed because Jason wouldn't stop asking if I was okay. There, he said it. He expected Mr. Ray to make a big deal about it, but instead he just nodded. Good. Now let's dig a little deeper. Why did that bother you? Ben froze. That wasn't part of the deal. He could give surface-level answers, but going deeper? No thanks. I don't know, he said quickly. Mr. Ray gave him a look like he saw right through him, but he didn't push. All right, but let's try it again. Pick another emotion. Ben clenched his jaw. He wanted to be done with this, but something about the sentence on the board stuck with him. I feel blank because blank. He swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. Before he could stop himself, he muttered, I feel stupid because I failed my quiz. The words hung in the air. He had never said that out loud before, and somehow, it felt different hearing it. Less suffocating, less like it was going to crush him. Mr. Ray nodded. And what do you think is worse, feeling like you failed or holding it in and pretending you don't care? Ben hesitated. The second one, obviously, but he wasn't ready to say that yet, so he just shrugged. Mr. Ray smiled knowingly. We'll work on it. The weight of words. Ben left the office feeling lighter, not fixed, not magically okay, but different. For the first time, he realized that maybe there was a reason he always felt so exhausted. It wasn't just school or stress. It was the weight of everything he never said. And now, maybe he was ready to start letting some of it go. Chapter 3. I feel blank because blank. Ben wasn't sure if the counseling session had changed anything. It wasn't like he suddenly wanted to start talking about his feelings every 5 minutes. But something about saying, I feel stupid because I failed my quiz, had been different. For the first time, the feeling wasn't just inside his head. It was real. It had a name. And somehow that made it a little less overwhelming. Still, he wasn't sure if he was ready to use it in real life, until life gave him no choice. The first test. Ben was doing his best to forget about school when he got home. He grabbed a snack, headed straight to his room, and put in his earbuds. But just as he sat on his bed scrolling through his phone, there was a knock on his door. His mom. Hey, she said, stepping inside. How was school? Fine. She leaned against the doorframe. Did you get your quiz back? Ben's stomach twisted. Of course she had to ask. He kept his eyes on his phone. Yeah. She waited. And? Ben clenched his jaw. He could lie and say it was fine, change the subject, and try to move on. But instead, he heard himself say, I feel frustrated because I studied, but I still did bad. His mom's expression softened. I'm sorry, Ben. I know you worked hard. That was it. No lecture. No, you should have done this. No disappointment. Just understanding. And for once, that was enough. The next challenge. The next day at school, Ben was still getting used to the idea of actually saying how he felt. It was one thing to say it to his mom. It was another thing to say it to his friends, especially Jason. Ben had been avoiding him since yesterday's weird lunch moment, but there was only so much dodging he could do before Jason cornered him at his locker. Jason leaned against the lockers, arms crossed. All right, man. Are you going to tell me what's up, or am I supposed to guess? Ben sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Dude, it's not. Jason gave him a look. Don't say it's not a big deal. You've been acting different for weeks. Ben stayed quiet, because Jason wasn't wrong. Jason sighed. Look, if you don't want to talk, fine. But I'm just saying, you've been my best friend for like 5 years. If something's wrong, you can tell me. Ben hesitated. The old him would have shrugged it off, changed the subject. But he wasn't sure he wanted to do that anymore. So instead he said, I feel overwhelmed because everything keeps piling up, and I don't know how to deal with it. Jason blinked. Ben braced himself for some kind of awkward reaction, but Jason just nodded. Yeah, I get that. Ben frowned. Wait, you do? Jason shrugged. Yeah, school's been a lot lately, and my parents won't stop breathing down my neck about grades. Ben stared. Dude, why didn't you say anything? Jason smirked. I don't know. Maybe because I didn't know how. Ben couldn't help but laugh. Of all the things he had expected, this wasn't it. For so long he thought talking about emotions was a weakness. But here Jason was, his best friend, someone he had always seen as confident and unshakable, going through the same thing. Maybe it wasn't just him. A new perspective. That night, Ben sat on his bed, staring at his ceiling. He thought about how different the last 2 days had been, how his mom had actually listened, how Jason hadn't judged him, how saying, I feel blank because blank, had somehow made everything seem less impossible. For so long, he had thought that bottling things up made him strong, but now he was starting to wonder. Maybe real strength was saying, this is what I'm feeling, and this is why. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. Chapter 4. The hardest words to say. Ben had been getting better at saying how he felt. Not perfect, not all the time, but better. It was easier with his mom now. It was easier with Jason. But there was one person he still couldn't say the words to. His dad. The tension at the dinner table. It started at dinner. Ben sat across from his dad, pushing his food around his plate. His mom was talking about work. His dad was barely listening. Then mid-bite, his dad looked up and said, So, how was the history quiz? Ben froze. His mom knew the answer already. Jason knew the answer. But his dad? His dad expected one answer. Good. Fine. It went well. Lying would be easy, but that wasn't what he wanted to do anymore. So he swallowed, took a breath, and said, I feel frustrated because I studied, but I still got a bad grade. Silence. For a second, Ben thought his dad hadn't even heard him. Then his dad set his fork down. He sighed. Well, what do you want me to say? You should have studied harder. Ben's stomach dropped. Of course. This was exactly why he never said anything. His chest tightened, anger bubbling up fast. This was why he kept things inside. Because why say anything if no one listens? He wanted to shove his chair back. He wanted to snap. Forget it! He wanted to storm out, like always. But then, He thought about the soda can, and instead of reacting, he took a breath. He let the storm settle. Then he said, "I did study. That's why I'm frustrated." His dad stared at him. Then finally he said something Ben didn't expect. "All right, so what's the plan?" Ben blinked. "What?" "The plan," his dad repeated. "You don't want another bad grade, right? So what's the plan to fix it?" Ben hesitated. He hadn't thought about that. Maybe I'll ask the teacher if I can retake it." His dad nodded. "Good, that's a start." It wasn't some big emotional moment. His dad didn't suddenly become the world's most understanding person, but he had listened. And for now, that was enough. The real test. Ben was starting to realize something. Saying "I feel blank because blank" didn't fix everything. It didn't make people magically understand, but it made things clearer. It helped him understand what he was feeling, and it helped others understand him. But there was still one more test. When it mattered most. The next day at school, Ben was in math class when he saw her. Victoria. Victoria was usually loud, funny, always smiling. But today, she was quiet. Too quiet. And then Ben noticed something else. Her hands were shaking. She was gripping her pencil so hard it looked like it might snap. And suddenly Ben saw himself. The way he used to feel when he bottled things up. The way his own hands used to clench under the table when the pressure was too much. Without thinking, he leaned over and whispered, "You okay?" Victoria didn't look up. She just nodded quickly. Too quickly. Ben hesitated. Then softly he said, "You know, I used to think it was easier not to talk about stuff." Victoria glanced at him. Ben tapped his notebook and wrote, "I feel blank because blank." Then he slid it toward her. Victoria stared at the words. She didn't write anything. But after a long pause, she whispered, "I feel overwhelmed because I think I'm going to fail this test." Ben nodded. "Yeah, that's rough." She let out a breath. "I haven't told anyone that." Ben smirked. "Yeah, I know the feeling." The lesson that stuck. Ben was still learning, still figuring it out. But for the first time, he wasn't just helping himself. He was helping others too. Because once you learn to say, "I feel blank because blank," you can help someone else say it too. And that changes everything. Chapter 5. The Power of Words. Ben had always thought words were just words, that they didn't matter, that keeping things inside was easier, that saying how you feel doesn't change anything. But now he wasn't so sure, because lately words had been changing everything. The shift. It wasn't like Ben had become a totally different person. He still had bad days. He still got frustrated. He still felt overwhelmed sometimes. But now, instead of pretending nothing was wrong, he talked about it. And every time he did, it got a little easier. A moment with Jason. It was Friday night, and Ben was hanging out at Jason's house. They were watching a game, half paying attention, half scrolling through their phones. Then Jason sighed, loudly. Ben glanced over. "You good?" Jason hesitated. Ben smirked. "Dude, I know that sigh. Spill." Jason sighed again. "I don't know, man. My parents are on my case about college. They keep asking where I want to go, what I want to do. I don't have an answer." Ben nodded. "That's a lot." Jason leaned back. "Yeah, I just feel..." He hesitated, then smirked. "I feel lost because everyone else seems to have their future figured out, and I don't." Ben grinned. Jason rolled his eyes. "Shut up. I knew you were going to say something about that stupid sentence." Ben laughed. "But it works, doesn't it?" Jason exhaled. "Yeah, maybe." Ben tossed a pillow at him. "See? Told you." And just like that, Jason felt a little better. Because sometimes the hardest part wasn't dealing with a problem. It was saying it out loud. The final challenge. Ben had one last test to pass. It wasn't a math test. It wasn't a history quiz. It was something harder. Because talking about emotions with friends was one thing. Talking about them with his dad was another. A real conversation. One night, Ben was in the kitchen, grabbing a snack, when his dad walked in. He reached for a glass, poured some water, then leaned against the counter. "How's school?" his dad asked. Ben paused. This was the part where he usually said, "Fine." But this time he didn't. Instead, he said, "I feel stressed because school's been a lot lately." His dad froze. Not in a bad way, more like he hadn't expected it. Ben could tell he was choosing his words carefully when he finally said, "Yeah, I get that." Ben blinked. "You do?" His dad nodded. "Of course. I felt the same way when I was your age." That surprised him. Ben had never heard his dad talk about emotions. Not like this. Then his dad took a breath. "Listen, I know I'm hard on you sometimes. I just want you to be okay, to have options, to feel prepared." Ben hesitated. Then for the first time ever, he said, "I feel pressured because I don't want to let you down." Silence. Then his dad exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Ben, you're not letting me down. I just want you to do your best. And if you're struggling, I'd rather you tell me than keep it to yourself." Ben swallowed. "Yeah, I'm working on that." His dad nodded. "Me too." It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was real. And that was enough. What Ben learned. Ben still had bad days. He still got annoyed, stressed, and frustrated. But now he had a tool. Now he knew that saying, "I feel blank because blank," didn't mean you were weak. It meant you were self-aware. It meant you were in control. It meant you weren't just bottling everything up until you exploded. Because emotions? They didn't have to control you. You could pause, breathe, and let the storm settle. And once you learned to talk about your emotions, you could help others do the same. Emotions don't have to control you. When you learn to pause, breathe, and say, "I feel blank because blank," you take the first step in understanding yourself and helping others do the same. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. What's an emotion you've struggled to express, and how do you handle it now? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you found this video helpful, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel and lets me know you enjoy this kind of content. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future stories like this one. Join our community of learners, dreamers, and people who want to grow together. Share this with a friend who might need this message today. You never know who could use a reminder that it's okay to talk about how they feel. The Mind Gym Academy. Thanks you for watching, and remember, your words have power. Keep growing, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next video.